Chapter 3 Idealism. It is best to begin one's description of Hegel's conceptual operations with a specific methodological peculiarity which is associated with the period historical term Setzen or to posit. The term is probably an invention of Fitz, or at least one brought into wider currency and foreground by him, insofar as his own philosophical system turned on the primal act whereby the subject or the I somehow posits the not I in some first Big Bang theory of being. But Hegel's wide-ranging use of the act of positing is scarcely so melodramatic as this and offers a better way of grasping the dialectical operation as such than all the triadic movements customarily associated with that process. It would be tempting to describe what is posited in terms of presuppositions, for positing somehow always takes place in advance of other kinds of thinking and other kinds of acts and events, and the grasping of what has already been posited, always already as one successful contemporary formula has it, is often taken to be the surest road to analysis and to understanding the structure of what happened in the first place. Yet presuppositions and presupposing would seem to anchor us firmly in mental operations and in thinking as such. At best they could lead to ideological critique and to the unmasking and denunciation of prejudices. Even there, however, Gadamer's denunciation of the prejudice of such ideas of prejudice is helpful 20 insofar as it reminds us that what we are really interested in is not thinking so much as being in the world, and that while there can certainly be errors and unwarranted presuppositions in thinking, it is a little harder to imagine what form those might take existentially. Thus, rather than thinking in terms of axioms, belief, presuppositions, and other such conceptual ballast, it might be better to try to convey the specificity of positing in terms of theatrical settings or pro-filmic arrangements, in which, ahead of time, a certain number of things are placed on stage, certain depths are calculated, and an optical center also carefully provided, the laws of perspective invoked in order to strengthen the illusion to be achieved. Even though the suggestion of fictionality and of calculated illusion remains very strong in this example, it might well help to convey the kind of analysis necessary to explain the effects of a spectacle provided in advance, how the sets were put together, what the lines of flight are, the illusion of specific depths, the lighting in foreground and background, etc. The most famous exemplification of positing for the post-Kantian philosophers was indeed the one to which the above-mentioned act of fit attempted to respond, and that is Kant's idea of a noumenon or thing in itself. The separation of reality into things as they appear to us and unknowable things in themselves is generally thought to be a compromise whereby Kant saves subjective reality itself along with the development of a very refined and complex structural analysis of the ways in which the human mind necessarily processes the inaccessible raw data of that reality. Compromises, however, never really last, even though this one, like Aristotelianism before it, becomes for all its complexity the very working ideology of Western common sense, and Kant's solution, misunderstood as yet another idealism, albeit of a more complicated and subtle kind, satisfies neither the empiricists /realists on the one hand, nor the idealists on the other, that younger generation of post-Kantian German philosophers called into being by his extraordinary system. On the one hand it is felt that Kant is essentially an analysis of what remain purely subjective projections out onto an unknowable world, while on the other, fault is found with the premise that there exists a kind of being about which, since by definition we cannot know it, it seems impossible that we should be entitled to affirm its existence in the first place. Famously, Hegel's reaction to the sensible limits Kant's critique sets for human knowledge and philosophizing lies in a closer scrutiny of the very category of the limit itself. We cannot set a limit, he points out, without somehow already placing ourselves beyond that limit. It is a devastating insight, which at once destabilizes the critique and deprives it of its carefully argued pre-philosophical and anti-metaphysical precautions. Hegel's post-Kantian colleagues already chafed at the ban on metaphysical speculation which the Kantian critique seemed to impose. Now, presumably, the floodgates have been opened. But if Hegel's analysis of the limit characterizes a formal strategy for problematizing the doctrine of the noumenon, it does not seem to offer any particularly concrete way of dealing with the problem itself. This is then the function of the doctrine of positing or of the Setzen. It will now transpire that Kant's theory, phenomenon and noumenon, looks somewhat different if it is grasped as a specific way of positing the world. At that point it is no longer a question of belief, of taking the existence of objective reality, of the noumenon, of a world independent of human perceptions, on faith. But it is also not a question of following in Fit's footsteps and affirming that objective reality, the noumenon, which has now become the not I, is summoned into being by the primal act of the I, which posits it, now using the term in a metaphysical sense. Rather, that beyond as which the noumenon is characterized now becomes something like a category of thinking, along with the limit itself. It is the mind that posits noumena in the sense in which its experience of each phenomenon includes a beyond along with it, in the sense in which the mirror has a time, or the wall an outside. The noumenon is not something separate from the phenomenon, but part and parcel of its essence, and it is within the mind that realities outside or beyond the mind are posited. To be sure, the language of the mind and of thinking is too narrow and specialized for this more general structural principle, which is also a dialectical one. The more fundamental question for such a doctrine, or for such a method, for such a perspective, if you prefer, is not whether objective reality exists, but rather from what vantage point the operation of positing is itself observable. Are we not outside the mind in another way when we show how the mind itself posits its own limits and its own beyond? Are we not now obliged to appeal to some notion of reflexivity or self-consciousness in order to rise to such a new level, and is it not precisely that notion of reflexivity which is today everywhere philosophically called into question? I think this is so, and that we will need to return later on the vexed question of self-consciousness. We cannot deal with it now because we do not yet know where this new operation called positing, and its analysis and demonstration, will take us. To be sure, it will also take us all the way through the phenomenology itself, but we can at least perhaps now deal with the problem of idealism, which has not been disposed of by putting both Kant and Fit in their respective places, and which, indeed, Hegel himself will seem to endorse with his slogan of objective idealism, an attempt to square the circle which is unlikely to convince anyone. In any case, Hegel continues to use the word idealism throughout in what may be seen as a fairly aggressive manner. Take for example his pugnacious statement, this ideality of the finite is the chief maxim of philosophy, and for that reason every genuine philosophy is idealism. 21 Yet the nature of this ideality remains to be identified. We make a beginning with the approach of the stand to number. Now number is undoubtedly a thought. It is the thought nearest the sensible, or, more precisely expressed, it is the thought of the sensible itself, if we take the sensible to mean what is many, and in reciprocal exclusion, Ely 220, 154. This comment moves the scare word idealistic much closer to what we call the theoretical, in the sense in which number is self-evidently a constituent part of a whole theoretical or structural system of number, rather than some ghostly underpinning of being itself, as the more programmatic positions of Pythagoras or Galileo might at first suggest. Idealism in this sense is not an ontological proposition at all, it is something closer to an epistemological one. Meanwhile Hegel's interesting qualification, that number is the thought nearest the sensible if not the latter as thought itself, will very much constitute the initial topic of the Phenomenology whose opening chapter, on so-called sense certainty stages the paradoxical demonstration that what we grasp with our senses is not some unmixed immediate sensory reality, but is in fact, to put it indelicately, all mixed up with ideas and ideation. We will return to the demonstration in a moment. But first it will be in order to offer a somewhat different understanding of idealism than what is generally supposed when it is confused with spiritualism or thought to involve this or that ascetic repression of the body. It may well, to be sure, reinforce this last, as in Plato and to a certain extent Hegel himself, the arguments against the philosophical materialism slipping insensibly into the expression of a revulsion with the physical, but the two positions scarcely coincide, nor are they inseparable, as witness Spinoza's relationship with the body itself. We may also use the example of Berkeley's idealism, explicitly fashioned, he tells us, to restore an intensity of sensory perception deadened and muff-hate, philosophically obscured, by the various materialisms. 22. It is an argument, paradoxical for us today, which perhaps sheds new light on Bergson, and even on Deleuze. I should also here warn again against the assimilation of Hegel's technical term Geist to any of the various spiritualisms or religious philosophies. There is no reason to associate idealism with religion, or, I suppose, vice versa. Idealism must be understood as a specific theoretical response to the peculiar problems of consciousness. Indeed, materialism would in that case be understood first and foremost as a failure to pose those problems, and for Berkeley as well as Hegel, the philosophical defect of materialism lies in the incoherence of its concept of matter as such. Kant organized this problem in the most striking and productive way when he classified consciousness, the subject or the soul, as a noumenon and denied any possibility of knowing it in itself. Others have helpfully used physical analogies to reinforce the point. Our minds, looking out of our eyes, cannot see themselves or grasp what lies behind them. To shift from these physical analogies to temporal ones, it becomes clearer that as we are always conscious, even in sleep or dreams, a kind of lower level of consciousness or what Leibniz might call sensitivity, we cannot by definition know what it is to lack that attribute. What Hegel's contemporaries called the not I is that which consciousness is conscious of as its other, and not any absence of consciousness itself, something inconceivable except as a kind of science-fictional picture. Thinking, a kind of thought of otherness. But it is hard to understand how we could know something without knowing what its absence entails, and it may well be, as Colin McGinn argues, that consciousness is one of those philosophical problems which human beings are structurally unfit to solve, and that in that sense Kant's was the right position to take, that, although its existence is as certain as the Cartesian cogito, consciousness must also remain perpetually unknowable as a thing in itself. 23 This is not necessarily the last word on the matter, however, as agnosticism would seem to be a resignation to defeat and a less productive outcome than other conceivable ones. Hegel's idealism is one of those, and simply means that whatever we think about will remain thought, whatever else it may be. This can be taken as an affirmation of the situatedness of all thinking, something that will later on, in Heidegger, be thematized as such, but it does not necessarily imply the spiritualist consequence that in that case all being is thought in the first place, only the more obvious implication that all thought about being or beings is still also thought, or consciousness. But now we can return to our earlier discussion of positing. What does this idealism, as I've just characterized it, involve in the way of positing? It is clear enough that materialism will involve the positing of a beyond which exists independently of my consciousness, and which thereby also remains within my consciousness at the same time that it oversteps it. If such materialism constitutes a metaphysical proposition about reality, how then could any idealism avoid being metaphysical in its turn? I take it that what Hegel means by speculative is precisely this way of marking the unavoidably metaphysical act of positing a beyond as metaphysical in its very structure, as a hypothetical leap beyond which we cannot go. This third or speculative moment in Hegel's system, in which the substance of the outside world is affirmed as somehow being the same as that of subjectivity, in which the logic of the syllogism is affirmed as somehow being the same as that of life as such, constitutes Hegel's acknowledgement of a different kind of limit, which it may be better to examine historically rather than philosophically.